Thank you, everybody, and welcome to the Sports Innovation Lab's Ask Me Anything series. We launched this series a few days after most of the country was put on lockdown, and we launched it in an effort to inspire and motivate towards action during a time when the thought of pushing forward could feel especially daunting. So through this AMA series, we bring together leaders and trailblazers from across the industry, from outside the industry, and have hosted guests including NBA champion Pau Gasol, Octagon Stan Cohen, the founder of the Drone Racing League, the CMO of Spartan, the commissioner of the A10 conference. And we bring these leaders and provocateurs together to have an open and honest conversation about the state of the industry today, and what they're doing now and what they believe we all should be doing to prepare for the industry tomorrow and in the future. And now people often toss around the word expert, but our guest today, Dr. Laila Mintas, truly does the word justice. So we're thrilled to have her here. So before I go ahead and introduce Dr. Laila and Josh, this is an Ask Me Anything. So we want your participation through this chat. So I'm going to go ahead and just give you guys some quick instructions on how you can get involved. First, you're on mute. Please stay there. We will unmute you if we need to. We'll have you ask questions via the chat functionality, and I'll give you a quick tour on how that works if you're unfamiliar. This session is being recorded. So if you have to duck out or you miss it or you want to share it within, outside of your organization, we'll go ahead and follow up after this session with a link where you can view today's AMA. And please ask us anything. So to enable the chat to ask a question, just check out your function bar at the bottom of Zoom. You'll see a little chat icon. Click on that. That is going to expand a window on the right side of your screen. You can choose to post your question to everyone, where everyone will see your question, or if you want to send a question directly to Josh or myself privately for Dr. Laila Mintas, you can go ahead and select send to host, and it'll come to Josh and myself only. If you do share it with everyone, it's going to pop up right there, and we will be curating your questions throughout the session. And if I didn't mention, I'm Gina. I'm the COO of Sports Innovation Lab. Sometimes I forget to tell you who I am. But it's not about me. Today is about our expert guest, Dr. Laila Mintas. Dr. Mintas is a C-level executive and serves as an independent advisor in the sports and technology industry, including the sports betting, digital sports, and fan engagement sectors. She is a global thought leader on sports data, sports betting legislation, regulation, and sports integrity. Dr. Mintas has published more than 100 legal publications in the top academic and professional journals about sports betting and sports law, and she serves as guest professor at several universities, including Columbia University in NYC, St. John's University, New York, University of New Hampshire, Humboldt University, Berlin, and Germany, on topics such as sports law and sports integrity. Dr. Mintas is a lawyer by trade and has previously served as the deputy president of Sportradar, the head of legal and international development for FIFA's early warning system. And throughout her career, she has managed high-level relationships with league partners, including NFL, NBA, NHL, MLB, FIFA, and with clients including Google, Facebook, Twitter, ESPN, DraftKings, and FanDuel. Dr. Mintas is a preeminent voice in the sports betting sector, and we feel very lucky to have her with us today. This was easily one of the hardest, if not the hardest, bios for me to shorten today. So I highly encourage you to follow her and see what else she's achieved in her career. And, you know, we're thrilled to have you with us today. And hosting our conversation is Sports Innovation Lab co-founder and president Josh Walker, who leads our roster of over 60 clients in the industry on how to create breakthrough fan experiences and prepare their business for the fan of the future, something we call the fluid fan. He was formerly VP of research at Forrester, and Josh stewards our lab's research, as well as lead the lab's technology development and our executive leadership board program, which, like this series, brings together the most forward-thinking executives from across the sports world to drive innovation and change in the industry. So I'm gonna go ahead and hand it over to Josh to kick off the conversation, and then we'll get to your questions. So take it away.
Thank you, Gina. Dr. Mintas, thanks for joining us. One of the things that is in your bio that I'm most proud of is that you're an advisor to the Sports Innovation Lab. So it is always a pleasure to get to speak to you and share your wisdom with our clients and our audience. So thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me. It's a big pleasure and honor to be on that. And I love what the Sports Innovation Lab is doing, obviously, and I'm a big fan of that. And yeah, pleasure to be here.
Well, I think everybody who's joining today probably has a number of different aspects of the sports betting world that they're interested in. Some come from media, some come from the agency, some might just be very interested in doing the activity together. So what I wanted to do is just give you and myself a sense of who's on the call with us today. So I'm going to launch a quick poll just so you and I have a perspective of who's here. So I'm asking you all, do you bet on sporting events? Yes, no, sometimes. Just give me a quick sense of who's here, and we'll share that information with Dr. Mintas as we get going. So Dr. Mintas, while people are finishing this poll, can I ask you, I think most people want to know, what's the state of the industry right now, considering that there are no live sports to be wagering on? What's the feeling across the industry? What are people saying? And what's sort of the tone or tenor of like people's enthusiasm or optimism given with the state of the industry right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the entire world was hit really hard by that virus, and so is the sports betting industry. And the sports betting industry basically is hard hit by it because there's no sports going on. And if there's no sports, if sports is suspended, there's no sports betting, obviously, right? So the big problem for most of the operators right now is trying to survive in that environment and trying to be innovative, because only if you're innovative in those times, you can basically survive and get out of that in a successful way. And therefore, everyone in the sports betting industry is looking for unique content at the moment, because as there's no traditional sports, you need to show customers something to keep them entertained and keep them on your website, and basically get some revenues into the door by doing that, right? And so what we have been seeing so far is, since most of the normal sports, traditional sports that we are all watching, like the big US sports, has been suspended, some states have been pretty innovative in extending the list of sports that they approve for betting operator to provide to their audience. For example, New Jersey has just extended that list. And probably to give you a bit background, so if I'm a sports betting operator and I wanna offer certain sports for my audience to bet on, if I'm in New Jersey, for example, I go to the website of the DGE and I look up all the events that I can offer. So you cannot pick and choose what you want, what's out there in the world. You have to take that what's basically allowed by a regulator in the state that you're operating in. In my example with New Jersey, the DGE has just approved Chinese baseball, for example. It wasn't on the list before, but it's still going on. So as major sports are suspended, that's something to take on for a bookmaker right now. Or another example is table tennis, international table tennis was just added to that list. So you have to be innovative, you have to be flexible to offer sports that probably normally nobody would bet on and nobody would want to bet on. But now, as normal sports, or common sports, I should say, are suspended, you have to bring on something different.
So
they
can
do
I,
that, for example.
so I can jump in and just ask you, how does that happen? Because, you know, there's been like a glacial pace of how sports betting has gotten legalized, and it's fought over in these states one by one as it's moved across our country. So how do they do something within weeks of, you know, this pandemic shutting down sports to get some of these, you know, international sports approved for gambling?
Yes, a regulator can approve it. Usually they evaluate the risk and add things to that list that they feel like comfortable about to offering. In my examples, both are international and global sports. It's not like the second league in Kazakhstan soccer. So it's something which is probably valid to add to the list, but still something which is not very common usually in the US to bet on. So that's why they extended the list. Another great example is probably what West Virginia tried to do. So they tried to allow bets on federal elections, which is usually not allowed to do anywhere in the US. It's pretty common in Australia, for example, but not here in the US. And within seconds, they got shut down because the state regulator went in and said, that's not something that we can put on the list for approved events. So there's no betting on elections. Unfortunately, I think that would have been fun.
Yeah, it would certainly make the elections even more exciting on CNN, where John King would stand up and he could do the odds. He could, it'd be great. So listen, the other thing that I wanted to put on your radar, because we've seen a lot of this recently and a lot of talk about it, is all the virtual and digital sports and things of that nature that people feel is going to help fill the programmatic, the programming void, but also could help fill the sports betting void. Can you give our audience a sense of what digital sports and virtual sports look like in terms of sports betting while the live sports are not on?
Yeah, virtual sports have been around for a long, long time outside the US. It's a pretty common product in Europe, in Asia, etc. But here in the US, it wasn't really that popular. But now, as most traditional sport is suspended, it's a good alternative for a bookmaker to offer virtual sports. And if I'm saying virtual sports, it's a very broad term. So different things that you can associate with this. So a virtual sport can be, it's a sport simulation. So the computer is basically running algorithm and a kind of like a simulation of a game. So you basically see also the simulation. So it's not like real players. It's a simulation, as I said. And then you basically place bets on it. Sometimes these simulations are really good and they look like real players. Sometimes they use real teams for that. Sometimes it's just the blue team against the red team. Team A against Team B, not really brands associated with it, so not real teams. Depending on where you play your virtuals, that can vary. And then basically people bet on those simulations. So the algorithm basically runs the game and you can jump in and bet every 30 seconds, every 90 seconds, every 3 minutes, depending on what the bookmaker is offering. I actually, from a bookmaking standpoint, I am a fan of these virtuals if you offer them, if you have no traditional sports going on. It's a good alternative to offer something to your customer base. So far, we had enough to offer in the US, but now with sports being suspended, that's kind of like filling the gap. At the same time, it reminds me more of a slot machine because let's say every 60 seconds, you're placing a new bet on a simulation. So it's like putting in money into a slot machine every 60 seconds, right? It's not like sports is the focus here. It's more like being entertained and pushing buttons, really.
Yeah. So let me get to some of our questions because they're already coming in, and a number of people really want you to speak about the global sports betting market, which I know you're fluent in as well. So let's just see how this goes. First of all, I know you're familiar with the Bundesliga, so let's start with that one. The Bundesliga is talking about reopening the season in May. Do you think this will allow the leading European sports betting companies to begin offering bets again? And are there any barriers to renewing those bets? One of the things that we discussed, and you've been advising us on, is the idea that when there's no fans in the stadium, that sometimes changes the way that products are developed for this. So can you let me know sort of what your perspective on this is? Because the DFL has already said that most of those games will happen without fans in the stadium.
Yeah, being originally from Germany, I'm of course a big fan of the German soccer environment. But initially they were thinking, before they were before they decided to shut down sports entirely, they were thinking to play in empty stadiums basically, and now they basically returned to that idea. I think now, as there's not much of an alternative on the betting market right now, apart from virtual, some horse racing games, some international sports like table tennis and Chinese baseball, but there's not much really. So I think bringing in a world-class sport probably gives you at the moment a lot of betting volume and a lot of audience, because much more people will watch it because there's almost no alternative. Even if you usually don't watch German soccer, in those times you're probably doing that because it's limited. You're limited in watching other sports right now, and that's probably good for them building an audience. Also, for example, in the US, where soccer is not the #1 most popular sport right now. So even if the virus is gone, hopefully soon, then people hopefully keep watching German soccer, right? But I agree to your point. Usually, if there's enough alternative, I'm not sure if that would help growing an audience, because the fan usually likes their local their local clubs and follows them depending on where the fan is, right? So if we're moving, then we're moving to the club that we are supporting, etc. But so I think it will be interesting to see that happening.
So another question is really about market size. What is the most popular game, I'm assuming sport, people are betting on, and what is the total addressable market for that top game? Maybe that is in line with the virtual sports that we were just talking about, but could you also just give us a sense of like which sports drive the most handle in traditional sports?
Yeah, usually, and that's really one of the things that didn't went very well with the virus, is that March Madness, as the name says, it takes place in March and was just suspended very early on, is probably the biggest betting sports where people bet on. And that's across sports. So March Madness is huge in betting volume. Second, apart from that, is probably NFL, if we're talking about the US environment. And with the NFL, mostly, of course, the Super Bowl, which is only one day in a year, where we also see prop bets, for example, where in the US, where people really can bet on the performance of individual players, not only on who wins the game and results, etc. So those are usually the biggest sporting events from a betting standpoint in the US.
And there's a number of people that are concerned about the industry at large, meaning the companies like MGM, DraftKings, FanDuel, Sportradar, companies that really survive on the fact that consumer transactions are taking place and there's some transaction fee or service fee that's associated with that. The question here is about Sportradar, but let me ask it more broadly, which is that there's a number of these companies that are offering up now simulated games for betting or virtual sports. But how long could the sports industry, you're familiar with their cash flows, you're familiar with their balance sheets. How long could these companies survive if we don't have live sports for there to be wagering on?
Yeah, so to answer that question in general, there were some estimates out in the media where the numbers, and I'm not familiar with them in detail, but where these media articles basically were saying that companies like Caesars, MGM, Penn National, big players in the market, that they're running out of cash in a couple of months. And that's pretty scary. So some of them had let go 80% of their staff, which is of course very scary as well. But I'm positive and I'm an optimistic thinking person. So I would hope that we all survive that somehow. And in a worst case, like other states probably are doing, that the government needs to jump in and secure and rescue those. But overall, what those players can do is kind of like trying to be innovative now in those times. Even companies that hasn't been so innovative so far have to think differently and outside the box and try to do something. And with retail being totally shut down, there's not much you can do, but you have still online where you can engage your audience, where you can come up with products like virtuals. eSports is something that's still ongoing. Horse racing in some worlds of the some places of the world are still going on. So there's a lot that you can do, and you have to be innovative and see how you handle that situation to the benefit of your company and also employees, so you can basically rehire them once we're hopefully done with that crisis.
So this question, and again, I appreciate your patience with us. This is how AMAs go, you bounce around. But this one's about the state of affairs of the integrity of sports, which I know you're intimately familiar with. This question's really about Declan Hill's book, which is about crime and match fixing. But those books are years old now. The question is, where are we with sports integrity, crime, and match fixing? Have we gotten to a point where it's improved and it's really rare to see this, or is it still a situation that's pervasive in sport?
Yeah, I used to run, many years ago, I used to run FIFA's integrity efforts and CONCACAF's, which is also soccer, integrity efforts. Going back, then match fixing was a more like new phenomenon that many people didn't know what it was. Players, soccer players in that case, were naive, they didn't know about that. And what we learned over the years, going back, I'm now in sports betting since 2006 and monitor the market very carefully when it comes to integrity issues, because it's still kind of like a hobby for me, even if it's not my full-time position right now. But I think it has changed a little bit, but I think what has changed is more the reception in the market, that people know what match fixing is. I believe it's still taking place around the globe in most of the sports, and here and there are scandals all the time if you're monitoring that and you see it. In the US, there weren't really many cases yet. We had obviously cases in the NBA with a referee that were supposedly fixing games. But and then there are a few cases back in earlier days before we even had internet as we have it today. But usually every sport that's offered on the global sports betting market, so people can actually place a bet on the sport, can be fixed in theory, right? So we have to make sure we educate players and we pay players, etc. So if someone shows up and offers them $3,000 for fixing a game and losing intentionally, that they would hopefully decline that and report that case right away, so police can come in and find those people. Nowadays, of course, with less sports being on, that risk is lower. But in the long term, we will see a lot of fixing taking place.
I thought the example you gave me, and I'm still trying to figure out if the industry is using this term incorrectly or if they're just using it in two different scenarios. I've heard ghost games being referred to games as those games being played without fans. I've also heard ghost games being described as these games that never ever happened, but a data journalist that is responsible for helping create the book and the odds creates a simulated game almost by entering false data. Can you describe what happens in that scenario and why that's a potential threat in this environment where some of these leagues, especially the international ones, may be coming back to competition without fans in the stadium?
You make a really good point here. So the terms are used differently, because in match manipulation or sports integrity, we don't have a global body that's kind of like treating that in the same way. In doping, for example, you have a global body that's taking care of doping cases on a global level. We don't have that in sports
Right.
integrity, unfortunately. I think there's a big need for something like that, an overseeing body that kind of like monitors what's going on at global level. But so ghost games, so there are two things that we need to kind of like differentiate between. So one is match fixing. So in case of match fixing, the game really takes place, but people go ahead and fix the result or outcome of the game or the course of the game to place bets on the outcome, so they make money illegally from that. In terms of ghost games, it's sometimes now used for games that take place with in an empty stadium, basically without audience. But where this term really comes from a sports integrity environment is that you have people going ahead and basically faking that the game takes place. So the game in reality never takes place, but it's kind of like pretending it would. And how that works is that you have sometimes scouts being involved in that. So scouts are data journalists. All of the big data companies, they have thousands of scouts that they send to the venue. They're sitting there with little devices, looks like a mobile phone, for example, and they're typing in everything that happens during the game with a different combination. So let's say a goal takes place, they type in 112 or whatever. So they're sitting there in the stadium and they're supposed to collect that data in real time. So the data can go from the little device to the data company, and then from the data company within under 2 seconds in an ideal scenario to the bookmaker. So the bookmaker has that information soon enough to close the markets if in comparison to people in the stadium, because people in the stadium would, if that's not an ideal case, have that information before the bookmaker has it. So if they see a goal happen, they can still place a bet on the goal because it's a very safe bet. But the bookmaker hasn't updated his data, so he doesn't know that yet, and he takes a bet and loses money. So that's how that usually works. Now with the ghost games, the scout, for example, could be involved in that ghost game scenario, basically sitting somewhere else, not in a stadium, but pretending he is in a game, putting in some data so that the bookmaker at the end of the day, offers that game thinking the game really takes place. And then the match fixers basically, or the criminals, they basically place bets on that fake game that doesn't really take place to make money. And you would say, usually as a bookmaker, you need to know if there's a game taking place or not. But these games sometimes happen in the seventh division in soccer in Ukraine, for example. And then it's hard for big bookmakers to know if the game really takes place. So he relies on the data company, and the data company relies on the scout. And if the scout is involved in that, then we have a ghost game.
And what I love what you described this to me was that there's also a very almost analog way of telling whether or not the scout is actually there, because they listen for crowd noise. And if the crowd noise isn't there, it's harder to discern whether or not they're making this stuff up.
Absolutely, yeah.
So
usually, you listen in and you hear if there are noises, so you can evaluate if the scout is really in the stadium on a venue that's packed, or if he's somewhere sitting in his living room just pretending there's a game going on.
One of the really cool things about reviewing all the different technology that makes its way into sport is knowing how much machine learning is helping to either assist officiating with virtual assistants and refereeing and umpires calling balls and strikes and things of that nature. There's a question here that's really around like how much or how far along has the industry gotten in really determining the effectiveness or the impact that refereeing has on a match. And is there software, is there technology, is there an alerting system that can be used to kind of figure out if somebody's on the take?
Yeah, and I have to bring up a company that I'm not personally involved in, but I know these guys very well, US Integrity. they do things like that. So they are really looking into the performance of the referees and evaluating if there are irregularities. And sometimes it's always with monitoring. Sometimes you can review the data and you can find reasons for these irregularities. If you cannot find any reasons for that, then you know you have a case of match manipulation.
Yeah, and then you investigate further.
Then you have to investigate. You have to interview players. And as I said earlier on, in the US, there weren't really many cases yet known. But we also need to keep in mind we haven't really monitored so deeply.
Yeah.
And the more you monitor, the more you will find. I remember a case in my previous time in the soccer business where we had evidence that these match fixers were fixing an under 16 game, which means the players were up to 16 years old, so basically really kids. The match fixers went in and approached those players and offered them $3,000 for losing the next game, which the players took, and they lost the game. And we had evidence that they made millions of dollars with those games. So it's scary if you dig into the data to find really what's going on. And the only way you can prevent that is through education and awareness, of course.
Well, I know that's a serious issue, so I shouldn't be joking about it, but I do offer my son ice cream if he hits a home run. So I hope that's not part of it.
As long as you're not betting on it, it's fine.
I'm not.
And Josh, actually, that brings us back to the initial question that you asked about regulators putting on events. That's the reason why regulators are very careful on which events they approve. They wouldn't approve the tournament or the game that you're playing with your son, right? So they have to be careful. What kind of events would they allow people to bet on? And I need to say, with the federal election, as we mentioned that example earlier, that's something where you can really neutral and unbiased really prove what the outcome is. So why not offering things like that now in that environment? In the UK, people bet on which dress the queen is wearing at the wedding, etc. I mean, these are all things that you can objective evaluate. So I don't see a big risk in offering events like that, especially now as you don't have traditional sports that's going on.
I agree. If it's about betting, there are tons of things people could bet on. I think if it's about creating fan engagement and getting sports fans to do things online that they normally don't do, that requires just a little bit more sophistication. The idea here that one of these questions addresses is really something that's at the heart of, I think, the power of the sports betting lobby. How much influence do you think sports betting and the market is having on how quickly professional sports is returning? Is there a strong presence in Washington, D.C. that's, or even globally, I would think in other markets, that can influence the speed at which that returns? Or is it the media industry, or is it really just politicians wanting to get back to some level of normalcy?
Well, I would hope that the health of people is really the focus here. And if experts feel like they have enough evidence to say we all can go back and sports can come back, then we should do it. As long as there's a question mark, I think it's better to wait. And even if it hits the industry, and it hits all the industries really, really hard. But I think sports can do something else, and also sports betting operators could be helped differently than lobbying for sports to come back earlier. So I think what you can basically do is, for example, allowing betting types, as I just mentioned, right? So I call them fun bets, right? Like federal elections, I don't know, which dress the queen wears is more interesting for the UK, but you can think of similar things here in the US. But interestingly, those betting types are offered right now in the offshore markets. So basically where people have placed bets before we had PASPA going away. So that's that's pretty scary to me, because that shows that that industry is faster in adapting to this new normal than we are in the regulated markets. And that is a bigger risk in the long term as well, because now people get again used to place bets in the offshore market. So we have to bring them back on to our regulated and legal offerings once sports is back. And that's a big risk that I'm seeing. So from my perspective, I think regulators need to be more flexible right now in finding solutions with regulated and legal bookmakers in the US to expand what can be offered, so that the sports betting industry doesn't have to compete with offshore markets.
And one of these questions has to do with the US market competing with the offshore market and the odds that people are putting on these games and the products they're offering. One of the things that slowed the state-to-state adoption was everybody fighting over integrity fees and getting their hand in the pie, and the taxes and things of that nature. Do you think this situation will alleviate some of those negotiations, or at least make some of those issues go away because people need now to accelerate the revenue engine here? Or do you think that there's just too much money at stake and there's still going to be a logjam on the legal side?
That's an interesting question. I think, and I have never been a big fan of integrity fees and official data requirements, and but I think now it's really the time for everyone to do what's needed for the economy to come back. And I think now coming with integrity fees and official data requirements, etc. So basically squeezing more money out of the sports betting industry is not the right sign. I think that probably doesn't make it more easy for the betting industry to survive at the end of the day, right? I think everyone in the market is now cutting costs. To your point earlier, data companies, nobody's paying for, I assume, for data right now, because there's no data available apart from maybe eSports and little other things. But so the entire data industry is kind of like affected. And you have the entire sports betting industry being affected. Of course, there are things that you can offer, but the revenues went down. I think I saw some numbers. They are down like sometimes up to 80%. I mean, It's crazy. iCasino is something that's increasing right now. So basically you play casino games online. So some people are switching over to products like that to kind of like secure some revenues, but it's hard. And I think the leagues shouldn't push for any fees right now.
And you'll have to excuse my ignorance because I don't know the answer to this either. As the US has a state decentralized system, every state's responsible for their own regulation. Is there a country that has a nationwide system in place for best practices that they've implemented to manage sports betting nationwide?
I haven't really seen any country right now that came up with a perfect plan. I was reading that some of the countries announced that they would do packages to save their companies, but we have to see what that all means at the end of the day. And I think it's probably too early to say. And that's why you see cutting costs everywhere right now, letting people go. And I mean, once that comes back, once that normal life comes back with sports taking place, and taking place probably in empty stadiums is an alternative. I heard even rumors, and that's really a rumor that I just heard, so don't hold me to that, that US sports are thinking to fly players out to an island somewhere in the Caribbean to have sports taking place there. And we have to see if that's happening or not. I think it's good if sports is creative in finding solutions, because we have to give people some content, something they can engage with right now for many reasons, not only for revenues, but also kind of like to keep that society united.
I think a mistake a lot of people make in the industry is that the esports competitions have been able to fill a particular void in the media experience for a lot of fans. We know from our research that a lot of these esports fans are not necessarily the same traditional sports fans. Is the same true with betting? Is there a different type of fan that bets on esports than bets on traditional sports, or do you see a lot of crossover in those two demographics
Yeah,
or
esports
those
is
two communities?
Yeah, esports is very interesting, and I'm a big fan of kind of like monitoring the esports industry. So you have a very young audience compared to traditional sports. I mean, these are kids, right? And you have a massive audience on a global level. Think of Fortnite, where I believe 440 million people watched the competition, which is insane. It's bigger than
The
every
World Cup.
sports.
The-
The
yeah,
World Cup,
yeah.
right? So this is a new. I mean, people say esports is coming. I believe it's already here, and I said that before a few times already. And now you have esports betting, which is basically still the underdog, but it's happening already on a global level. There are a few problems with that. One is, for example, that esports isn't really regulated in many countries around the globe. And therefore you have a lot of gray markets also when it comes to sports betting. So you have outside the US, you have big players like William Hill offering esports. You have Bet365, which is a European bookmaker, or Asian European bookmaker, offering esports outside the US because it's where it's legal, obviously. But you don't have much yet in the US. But at the same time, esports betting hit 1 billion in revenues end of last year, which is a great starting point. And we will see that now, because of the virus, probably getting much more expedited than it would usually have been, but it was basically increasing already.
I don't know how familiar you are with the Indian market, but there's a question from a legal and regulations perspective. How would you expect that this COVID-19 and post-COVID world affects the largely unregulated betting market like an Indian market?
That's a very good question. I know that fantasy sport is legal in India, but from what I have seen, is kind of like still early steps. With the illegal market, and I have no insights, and I'm not too familiar with the betting market in India per se, but I would assume the same as we see now with the offshore market here around the US, is that the offshore market, that they find ways to, because they don't have too many regulations, etc. They don't have to pay too many taxes, etc. So they find ways to survive pretty well, usually, those crises, would be my guess. But I have no underlying data for that. But at the same time, I wonder, in those environments where people really need to survive, I mean, India is hit really hard by the virus, unfortunately. I wonder if people still bet so much on sports betting, or if they're more focused on kind of like making sure they are safe. So that's another unknown, but I think we have to see how that plays out.
So maybe that's a good time for me to launch our second and final poll. The first poll, Dr. Mintas, I don't know if I shared the results with you, and I think as hosts, we're not always able to see it, but we have about 30% of people on here that do engage in sports betting, 30% that do sometimes, and basically 30% who do not. So right now I'm asking everybody, do you believe this situation changes the interest in sports betting, whether it increases interest in sports betting, stays the same, or decreases? So we'll let people finish this, and then we will, the situation is definitely COVID, Arnie. So yes, I don't know of any other situation right now that I'm as obsessed with as I am this situation. So I did take that as an assumed I apologize.
Another good question, Josh, would be if those people that are betting, if they bet in the regulated environments or if they bet offshore right now,
Yeah.
where you have much more alternative and entertaining products. Unfortunately, I need to say, right? I'm not a big fan of pushing people into the offshore markets because you have no customer protection there. You don't know if you get your money that you're placing and that you win, if you ever get it back. And if there's a problem, then you have nobody who helps you with getting it back. I mean,
so the answers are that 52% believe it'll increase when this, sports comes back. It'll 30% said it'll stay the same, and 15% said it's decreasing interest in sports betting. So I have a few final questions for you, and then we'll wrap up here. Do you see the rise of micro betting with esports or gaming?
absolutely. I think.
What is micro betting?
I mean, if I get you right, you have in these esports games, and it depends on the game, obviously. You have a lot of these shooter games, right, where you just shoot people, and sometimes you can basically, depending on which game we are talking about, you can buy little things. You can buy a better weapon, etc. You can bet on. You can basically, there are different betting types. You can bet on how many, or first kill, for example, is the best example. First kill, who kills first?
Yeah.
Amount of kills, things like that.
Micro is the size of the bet, according to Courtney, right? So it's like a micro transaction. It's a micro bet. It's a smaller currency for something that may or may not happen in the game. Is that correct?
Probably yes, but and this probably brings us back to the terminology in general. Maybe I'm wrong, but I thought also that you use that term basically for these skin games, skin bets that you play. But don't hold me to that. So I heard this term sometimes in relation to that as well. So that you basically buy and you bet on those little events that are happening during a game. In esports,
almost like a prop bet in esports,
right? Yeah, okay. But I'm not the esports player, so there are people probably out there that know it better than I. But I think those skin bets are also very interesting, and I think that's, as you said, similar like prop bets in traditional sports. And then you can, in esports, you can of course bet on those normal events like who's winning, and sometimes we have esports. They're not only the shooting games, right? They're also sports like NBA and soccer, etc. You name it. And those can be a very good alternative right now for people that love traditional sports and don't like these shooting games too much.
All right, so I'm going to ask my last question, and then we'll wrap up here. We'll definitely follow up with a number of you who didn't get your questions asked. Thank you guys for all participating. Last question I have is on mobile betting. What's the state of mobile betting, whether it's in the U.S. or abroad? Are there best practices for that, and when do you think we're going to see that a little bit more pervasive in this industry?
Yeah, even before the virus hit the industry, mobile betting was already in most of the states where it's allowed, 75+%. So I think in New Jersey, the last numbers, it was even around 85%. And before the virus hit the industry. So mobile is the future. And I always like to say, nowadays we do everything on our mobile phone, right? We book our hotel, we pay with a mobile phone, we call our Uber, and we place our bets with the mobile phone. So that's so common sense for our generation, I would say, but even more for the new generation that's coming behind us. But some states haven't really allowed online betting yet, which is, from my perspective, really insane. Because
can I pause and ask why? Is it a security reason? Is it because the carriers are, sketched out by the idea that they'd be collecting bets? Is there an age verification thing? What's the problem?
Honestly, and I probably don't make friends with that statement, but I think it's to secure, to save the retail business and to help the established retail providers and the casinos. So if you have a retail offering, then you have to go into a casino. So you eat, you drink, you do other entertainment, etc. So people or the regulators probably want people to still go into the casinos and drive the traffic into the casinos. So, but why I am not a big fan of it is not because I have something against casinos making money. No way. I see a big risk if you have to go to a casino to do online to do sports betting, or you have an alternative sitting in front of your TV at home and playing offshore. Some people, a lot of people probably decide to stay home and play offshore instead of driving a few miles to the next casino. And that's a risk. So with that, you basically have people playing offshore in the illegal offshore markets, where there's no tax revenue for the states, no consumer protection, and that's not what we want. We want people to play regulated and legal in the US, and we can only push them to do that if we offer them legal alternatives. And driving up to a casino for a few miles, many people wouldn't do that.
Yeah, and I think now more than ever that revenue diversification of having people come in and do all those other events and lifestyle things is going to be incredibly important. So I don't think this is going to ease pressure at all. One of the things about the Sports Innovation Lab, which we pride ourselves in, is we're always able to find out all the information we want to about a particular topic through our data and looking at the information that's publicly available and talking to experts. The sports betting market is always the most challenging thing for us to get our arms around because people don't tend to write about it a lot, surprisingly. And the technology companies are a little bit cagey about what's actually happening. So we always, always, always value the time we get with you. So thank you so much for joining us today. Is there anything you want to end with, Dr. Mintas?
I want to thank everyone for listening in, and if you have any questions, I'm available at Twitter and LinkedIn. Reach out and shoot me a message.
Awesome. Thank you again for joining us. Dr. Laila Mintas, sports betting expert, really appreciate your time today. Gina, you want to wrap up?
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much. If you enjoyed today's discussion and conversation, want to keep that going with experts like Dr. Laila Mintas and some of our other AMA guests, as well as over 400 other sports professionals, please join our Slack community. You'll go ahead and you can see the bit.ly/join Slack SIL on your screen. We'll also send you that link. And join us on Tuesday next week, where we welcome Sean Kerrigan from Intel. He is the Director of Experience for Intel Sports. I'll go ahead and paste the link for that into Zoom as well. So thank you again, Josh and Dr. Mintas. Everyone, please be safe. And we look forward to seeing you all back here next week on Tuesday at 1 p.m.
Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care, Dr. Mintas.